Hey, well, thank you very much, everyone. I just have to confess I didn't realise there was going to be so much food around when I sort of constructed the introduction to my presentation. So you may want to stop eating just for a few minutes. So just some notes. Like there's a box here that just will have sort of the general sources that I'm working from. So, so for whatever it is that I'm saying. So just to, if you have some interest, and then each slide has got this little corner, because one of the things I like to do is I've been messing around a little bit with Midjourney to sort of generate images of what the future of Christianity might look like, and it's just fun to quite share them every now and then when you've got the chance. So it's all sort of as part of that thing of trying to sort of envisage and help us sort of feel more connected to sort of the long-term future of Christianity and the long-term future of the church. Yeah, so I'll start with this. The observation that if we were in London as we are right now, sanitation is rarely a problem. That's because there's this super sewer that was built by Joseph Bazalgette. And in the first half and second half of the 19th century, they built 1,000 miles of underground drainage. And up till essentially quite recently, that's been doing a great job. And it's overly simplistic to think that this rather future-proof sewer system, which is arguably the most disruptive civil engineering project in London's history, was a fruit of generosity. The last generations of Londoners simply had the foresight and the sufficient positive disposition to the city's future that they undertook such an enormous job. The historical reality was quite different. It's all about the Great Stink, as it was known, of 1858. So in the period of 50 years up to that point, the population of London had more than doubled from 1 million to 2.5 million people. And sanitation became a huge problem. The Thames is tidal, or it was then, and so the vast quantity, as the word goes, effluviant that was dumped into the river did flow, but it tended to actually then come back again. And it was constantly being added to by the city's daily life. So it's very difficult for us to really imagine how awful that would have been. So Faraday, the great father of electrical engineering, he wrote a letter of complaint to the Times newspaper, where he expressed concerns about waves of feculence on the Thames. And he wrote to Parliament, and Parliament acted. There was a bill that was rushed through, became law in 18 days to provide the huge amount of money needed to solve the problem. I would argue that knowing about the state of the river would not have been enough to prompt action. We have to remember that the Houses of Parliament are next to the river. The smell of the Thames was so bad that the curtains in the Houses of Parliament were soaked in chemicals to block that smell. And at the time, before any theory of germs, smell meant disease. So the members of Parliament perceived themselves to be at risk of contagion, especially of cholera. And so it was the understandable self-interest of the parliamentarians that forced the issue, that motivated a course of action that had a secondary effect of benefits for future generations. And so I argue today that that's in a sense how things work. Effective reasons that motivate actions that are to benefit humanity's future, especially the long-term future, are those that impact experience today. So I'm very much a Catholic theologian trying to respond in some sense to existential risk. So there's sort of a tangential element here, sort of me being here. But in this time of existential risk, we are trying to promote regulating them in some sense. And regulation requires sacrifices, voluntarily weakening a nation's nuclear arsenal, delaying the benefits from the development of AI, limiting or inconveniencing our use of resources to sustainable levels, generally investing the benefits that we will not enjoy. And sacrifices like this require motivation. If I'm to make some sacrifice for the sake of a temporally distant good, I must first acknowledge some moral standard that requires I do so. I must then perceive an opportunity to act meaningfully, and then I must experience some kind of motivation to uphold that principle. That's the motion from a judgment to an action. So the parliamentarians in the 1850s, they recognized the value of a clean river. They were in the right place to make a difference in the House of Commons, and they had plenty of motivation then to do so. And then action was actually taken. But more generally, however, we have to reflect that these steps are vulnerable to disruption when applied in future cases. When people are under pressure from immediate concerns, then they do overlook the pertinence of moral values, or almost subconsciously exclude future others from their moral circle. Perceiving an opportunity to act meaningfully in the vast question of humanity's future is threatened by a general feeling of helplessness, as the great aphorism, "No snowflake in an avalanche ever feels responsible." And then even if these first steps are taken and a moral judgment has been made, this only indicates an action and doesn't demand it. And that third step of motivation is quite difficult in future cases, because there's this gap between accepting judgments and reasons to act for the benefit of the future for the sake of benefits that we're distant from. So if we want to secure humanity's future, we can look for ways in which future goods have meaning for us now to help motivate that. And I'm going to argue today that secular hope, based on commonly held present-day moral thinking, fails to offer firm grounds for motivating the required sacrifices by which we live out a moral relationship with the future. And it's worrying because it's the most common way people try to do it. Now, this is not some sort of very critical, controversial claim. There's a wonderful self-honesty in long-termist writing. And a lot of the best-known thinkers who promote this concern share that uncertainty. Nick Bostrom really hopes and indicates a need for mixed ethical theories that include non-consequentialist side constraints, is how he puts it. But he doesn't identify what those side constraints could be. Annette Bayer, in her landmark Defense of Future Rights, concludes that she is unaware of any moral theory that effectively captures the right reasons for the right attitudes to past and future persons. So there's this intriguing tolerance amidst long-termists for working around this awareness that something is missing. And my aim is to point out that there is this lacking moral grounding, and I'd make the case that Christianity can help. So I now need to just make some sort of contextualization of what I mean by secular hope. And the main point is that the hopeful gaze towards the future that is commonly found among long-termists is not something that's sprung up out of a philosophical vacuum, but is the fruit of a very long process of roughly 4 steps. So some of you will be familiar with these sorts of ideas, that in the ancient world, there was this idea of a cyclical conception of time. Empires rose and fell, and that was just how things were. But the monotheistic revolution then broke out of that, with the faith that history is in fact pointed towards a finality and an end. Christians ultimately still hold to that notion. Christian belief is almost entirely believing in a promise of what is to come. But there was a point when providence was taken off the table. And so a secular dream of progress replaced faith in providence. But nonetheless, there was still a drive for humanity's development. There was this gradual but inevitable increasing manifestation of the human spirit across time. Now we're in a situation of ambivalence. So the question of progress is, in a sense, gone. There's no longer a faith in the inevitability of it. The very sort of realization of existential risks really sort of was the final nail in that coffin. So when God and progress are removed from the equation, then a daunting ambivalence about the future does present itself. The contemporary man doesn't believe in any guidance, either by fate or by providence. So the highest possible value then becomes the future that can be created and provided for by ourselves. The highest we can go, the last remaining principle on which we can base expressions of future hope, is humanity's potential, freedom and agency, and the vast horizon of possible technological development. And that's kind of the optimistic nihilism that we get. It's sort of the remaining fullest possible expression of humanity's yearning for a future, if providence and progress are discarded. And in summary, you'll be familiar with this, the view is it's simply a brute fact that the universe exists and that we are self-aware creatures in it. Those are oddities that we're faced with, and there's little utility in questioning them. We just have to get on with things. Religion is just a way of coping with those oddities, but optimistic nihilism can counter it too. Our experience is just cosmic coincidence. We're a dynamic pattern. So if we have one shot at life, our experience is the most important thing. If the universe has no purpose, then we get to dictate what its purpose is. If the universe has no principles, the only principles relevant are the ones we decide on. We live for positive human experiences, food, books, sunsets, and being with each other. And if we are chance dynamic patterns, we might as well have the best time possible. Yes, and then we aim for the future. We hope to visit stars one day, cure diseases. And there's no reason not to have a good time, to do what makes us feel good. And there are then just bonus points if you then also make the lives of other people better. And even more bonus points if you help build towards the utopia of a galaxy teeming with blissful human beings. So if you read things like McCaskill's What We Owe the Future, or The Precipice, a lot of what's underlying that is basically this view. So I think, however, bonus points are actually an effective motivator for making sacrifices for the sake of future generations. And the prioritization of individual freedom undermines connections between future benefits and present day experiences that effective motivation requires. So there's these four types of motivation. It's one of the ways in which you can sort of put them into buckets. And there are challenges, I think, and again, this comes from that healthy sort of criticism that comes out of the movement. There are challenges for even justifying care for humanity's future. Utilitarians are paralyzed by the potentially infinite future and the vast numbers that come up. Promoters of duties wrestle to account for corresponding rights among people who don't yet exist. Contractualists struggle to strike up hypothetical agreements with future generations. So the uncertainty about the moral good of concern for future generations is itself a problem for motivation. One of the main types is principlism. So it's the motivation with the ultimate goal of holding to or promoting some kind of moral ideal. And if that moral ideal is unclear, if it's undetermined, then motivation is undermined, especially for duties-focused thinking. The crux of deontological thought is rational morality. So efforts to motivate action in terms of duties are limited to the emotional response stimulated by the experience of recognizing a duty rationally deduced. So if moral reasoning is unclear, then motivational impact is slight indeed. Likewise, the motivating power of utilitarianism is undermined by the unknowability of future good and doesn't really invoke a lot of emotional engagement. Projections and numbers relating to possible future social states the moral agent will never experience make little emotional headway, with the exception of those who happen to be predisposed to acting based on utilitarian arguments. As one long-termist I was speaking to put it, the problem we've got is that middle-class university-educated white guys with graphs tend to be most listened to by other middle-class university-educated white guys who like graphs. Sort of sharing the insights more broadly is difficult. Now, the other types of motivation are undermined as well. So just quickly, the other types are egoism, motivation with the goal of increasing our own welfare, like the 19th century parliamentarians solving their problems, which happens to have side effects of future benefits. Then altruism proper, motivation with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare, and collectivism, motivation with the ultimate goal of increasing a group's welfare. So I then argue that egoism is generally difficult to apply to future morality, as there's not a lot the future can do for us now. And that's made worse by any prioritization of individual lived experience as the most important thing. Secular applications of altruism to the future are disrupted as they generally depend on sympathy as the motivational element. And it's just hard to sympathize with the future possible state of affairs. And then collectivism in contemporary secular hope becomes that add-on, those bonus points that we might heroically choose to work for, whilst we generally focus on our own experience. So I do believe that this secular hope that's directed to prioritizing an individual's freedom and experience lacks a framework to compel me to choose a diminishment of that experience for the sake of some less tangible benefit of my own via future goods, for the sake of the good of some distant beneficiary, or the abstract good of the future humanity collectively. So simply a worldview that appeals to freedom as autonomy to pursue goals, and the resulting disharmony with constraints to satisfy present desires creates resistance to any claims made upon us by past and future generations. Now, good long-termist writing recognizes this, and they do seek creative ways of expressing the good that can come from making the heroic step towards more collectivist thinking. So Bayer, again, building on her case for future rights, ends and concludes her paper by promoting a sense of a transgenerational community, a big sort of human family, but admits that she relies, and I'm quoting here, rather dogmatically on old intuitions that she believes are generally shared. William MacAskill, in his recent book, which I saw on the bookshelf, really hopes to invoke egoism in a lot of his writing. So, for example, when he suggests people imagine the future people at a bar having a conversation, and they sort of look back on the past and sort of imagine us debating about whether or not there's a benefit in sort of promoting the future or not. This is all working towards stimulate some kind of shame or pride with respect to those future generations, but the impact is quite speculative. Similarly, good consequentialists like Toby Ord try to promote the care for the future by doing more than just presenting a comparative calculus between some future states, ABC, which contain X, Y, Z amount of good and suffering. Ord guides his readers to experience, for example, the present incapacity of imagining the goods the future might hold, arguing that the future generations could develop capacities to experience new goods, which could make possible entirely new forms of human culture, new games, dances, stories, new integrations of thought and emotion, new forms of art, potentially exploring the most distant reaches of what can be known, felt, created, or understood. He's trying to leverage some kind of emotional impact to essentially as weighing up those future goods. And there is quite a lot of motivational potential there, because he's then sort of really capturing the range of possible values that he's leveraging. Whatever it is people value, they are likely to be positively disposed towards a future that might contain more of it than they initially thought. So these sorts of efforts point us in the right direction, but they do feel like they're straining against self-imposed limits of method. And there's a second challenge that comes up, the relativism that comes alongside secular hope, that leaves us unequipped to envisage what a good future actually looks like. What should we be preserving? What should we be passing on? Should we not be worried that we might inadvertently galvanize values that ultimately limit the extent of human flourishing? So it's difficult to work towards a flourishing human future without some sense of what that means. I would argue there is in fact a great danger, I've got my Catholic priest hat on, that we abandon our values and fail to pass on the treasures that we've received and the collective wisdom about human flourishing from an ideological aversion of limiting the self-determination of future people. And so here, this is where I'll start to outline how sort of a Christian worldview can make a difference in some of these problems. So I won't go into much detail, largely because I think I might be the only Catholic in the room, and some of the details that I'm proposing. Oh, very good. Oh, great. But because I try to make this as ecumenical as possible, but I think just on the foundational general principles of the Christian faith, there's some really quick hooks for us to sort of latch onto. So first of all, there's this idea that in some kind of objective good, without which I think Christianity does fall apart, suggests that hope for the future is bound to a commitment to what one values, what makes life worth living, and that those things should endure. The normative should be a guiding star in shaping the future. Samuel Scheffler, who wrote a wonderful book, Why Worry About Future Generations, recognizes that many in our society no longer hold the traditional beliefs that in earlier times, and I'm quoting, underwrote people's sense of the connections among generations. He stops short of recommending the recovery of that. But I think it is for us as Christians to advocate the apparent regress from modern secular interpretations of history to their ancient religious roots. This is justified by the realization that we find ourselves more or less, and I'm quoting here Carl Lewis, at the end of the modern rope, which is worn too thin to give hopeful support. Anyone really that's concerned with progress towards an ultimate goal, or at least to building a better world, is ultimately still in the line of prophetic and messianic monotheism, however little they may think of themselves in those terms. As Christians, we recognize in any desire to safeguard the future, the manifestation of that part of human nature that needs a future. We are made in such a way that we cannot live without a future. So Bernbacher names the motivational problem. So there's this problem that we have of casting a moral net more widely is in opposition to the human instinct to attach moral force to emotion. He writes, there can be no more conspicuous contrast than that between what universalistic ethical systems such as Kantianism and utilitarianism expect of moral motivation and the evolutionary origins of morality in the low distant morality of the family, the clan, and the tribe. So what basis is there to develop universal fraternity? And how can you have, I would then say, common fraternity without a common father? Christianity, especially in more traditional denominations, has a well-developed lens by which we attribute meaning to the past. Turning that lens to the future expresses how our faith offers long-standing foundations on which meaningful relationship with future generations can be found. Our faith in God is future-orientated. He gives very little in the present. All the important things that are given are in the category of promise of what is to come. So this means to be a faith is to have a life that is living outward beyond the present moment. We live in a state of reaching out towards something else, something greater. And this has both heavenly and earthly dimensions. As a Christian, I flourish in a community that transcends my own lifetime. My faith refutes the false god of a freedom unencumbered by the freedom of others. A Christian recognizes that they do not belong to themselves, and fullness of life comes to itself by moving away from itself and finding its way back as relationship. The lines between egoism, altruism, and collectivism are then blurred by a faith in what Jesus Christ reveals to us about the human person in light of what it is to be divine. Through the Trinity, we come to know that freedom flourishes when it is closely knit in a union with other persons. Being a Christian, being like the Son, means not standing on my own, but living completely towards and being for others. We believe God guides the course of all history, so there's an inherent future aspect of our faith, in which the present is made relative to a wider horizon that runs far beyond the moment, and indeed beyond the whole world. Comparable to the compass which gives us orientation, the eschatological compass gives orientation in time by pointing to the kingdom of God as the ultimate end. So in the way that sailors of the ancient world needed a sun to orient their maps, a river needs a hill to flow. Morality needs a framework that transcends it to enable connections across generations, across time, to allow meaning to flow, to point us outwards beyond our immediate relationships, to draw us forward towards humanity's future. When those sorts of bonds with future generations are undermined, or they are undermined by the casting off of the apparent chains of past generations, then there is little left to carry meaning to us from humanity's future so that we can feel it today. But with that orientation, I see how my blessedness today depends on passing on my faith and the conditions of living that faith out to others, enacting in charity to the most vulnerable, who we now see includes those who God now knows before forming them in the womb, who have no voice by which to defend themselves today. The fullness of life that Jesus came to give me rests on becoming like him, which points me outside of myself with a hopeful gaze towards the future, which involves a deep love for all of humanity. We seek to become one another's hope and to set upon the future the seal of Christ's features. In short, it's the nature of our Christianity that it does in fact involve us deeply with humanity's future. The Christian faith has, and this is some of the practical concluding points, a firm set of values to inform a quite widely shared vision of humanity's future, evading the paralysis of uncertainty, and hopefully helping to avoid the tragedies that could arise in building a future of humanity without an established notion of what the human person is. The Christian faith as sources of moral growth, building up people in faith and charity as a living stone in the brotherhood of the church, the fraternity which draws me closer to the suffering or the flourishing of future Christians. The Christian faith dares to speak to secular power in a way that is increasingly scarce, and so could play a role in promoting civilizational virtues and promoting that moral conversion towards a greater care of our future family. The Christian faith rejects the priority of freedom and self-determination that gives rise to temporal parochialism, restoring connections with future generations as it treasures its past. Ultimately, the core of the gospel is a love for all of humanity as one would the closest family. So why would this not include future generations? So this situation is new for us as Christians. You know, theologians are really only beginning to actually understand some of these things and looking at them. But I think there is a unique contribution that an authentic Christian imagination has to offer for motivating care for humanity's future that is lacking in alternative accounts. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Peter. And now we'll have, again, about 10 minutes for discussion. So, questions? Okay, Dominic.
So very fascinating. But I mean, there's one big obvious question, because your main argument wasn't Christianity is true, it's helpful, motivating.
Yeah.
Then it makes it contingent upon the context. So if we're specifically talking about the long term, there might be contexts where Christianity proves unhelpful. So maybe in 31,000 years, there will be 2 centuries where we would need a certain type of attitude towards technology that's not available from within Christianity. So if you're making this contingent argument that Christianity is helpful, which I think is very valuable, but I mean, it's exposed to that problem.
Well, I think if we honestly believe that sort of Jesus Christ showed us the way, the truth, and the life, and is truth itself, I wouldn't take seriously the risk of there ever being a situation in which sort of an authentic Christian view is unhelpful. I think there's a question here about sort of always sort of as our historical context changes, undergoing at times quite painful process of understanding how the truths revealed to us in our Christian faith are best applied, sort of in that situation, how our faith speaks to us. One of the great principles of scriptural interpretation is that Scripture includes truths. Augustine has this wonderful line about there are verses in Scripture that have so much unlocked meaning, and he talks about he'll never know sort of what this great meaning that these future Scripture verses might have. So I think yes, ultimately yes, sort of the relationship between sort of our Christian faith and culture is always underpinned by the fact that we actually think it is true. And I think if we believe in our faith, we can have this quiet confidence that it always has something beneficial to offer. Because if we think, actually sometimes maybe my Christian faith is unhelpful in this situation, like something's gone really wrong. There's been a misstep somewhere. The other thing is that because what I sort of see on the other side from the long-termists, there's a really helpful pragmatism about it. They are aware that they need all the help they can get to get the world to change, essentially, for human civilization to undergo a process of moral growth. I was talking about these questions with a very famous Roman Catholic theologian in Rome. He said, gosh, those Oxford academics, they couldn't even stop Brexit. How are they going to stop the end of the world? That was sort of, and he was really quite pessimistic about the whole thing, not because he didn't think it was an important question, but just the ambition is vast, actually. And so, but then I would say, well, actually, sort of the Catholic Church, this is something Facer and I talked about on a, sort of, which you might hear more about later. you know, the Catholic Church has got well over 1 billion members, and actually sort of the Pope saying one thing once about the importance of sort of protecting humanity from the risks we're creating for ourselves will have more impact than sort of 20 books published by OUP in terms of actually making people think about as widely as possible making these changes. So I think we should never underestimate the impact that the Christian faith can have on culture. And if we start to entertain the possibility that sometimes it's not useful, yeah, we're in trouble. So.
Thank you. I think Harriet was first, perhaps, and then David. Yeah. So.
Thanks. Thanks so much for that. I found it really fascinating, and I particularly enjoyed the prompt to go back to Ratzinger's The Church of the Future. I read that for a while. Yeah. It was great. I maybe had a question around, and I did miss the very beginning of it. I apologise if you've already touched on this. The different meanings of the concept of hope, right? Where when you encounter the idea of hope, or like elpis in the Greek, or yachal, I think, in the Hebrew, there's something that is, there's a much greater sense of it being a concrete expectation rather than hopeful, wishful thinking. So something that may come to pass if we can impact it to happen, or something that we are pretty assured will come to pass because of God's providence or intervention. Maybe I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that, the tension between those two understandings of hope, so sort of secular and biblical, and also whether there's a risk that as Christians we turn too much to the way of dependence on that sense of hope, meaning that actually our actions are not as vital to changing the course of humanity and the safety of our future, because we have this sense that actually the Lord is going to sort this out.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, your question essentially follows the model of the $1 million question of just every Christian eschatology, which is how do you strike the right balance between, okay, so we, sort of, eschatology proper, and then what some people call realized eschatology. What does it mean for us now to believe that actually at the end all will be well and creation will be consummated and Christ will come again? And in some sense, that does seem to suggest that actually everything we do now is kind of pointless. So in my thesis proposal, I struck up the thought experiment of, if we kind of believed all that, then, we should all just go and become hermits and live in a cave, start reproducing and just bring this whole project to an end, and then it would just be better, if we all became sort of monks and nuns and priests, stop having children, just had like 80 years of just, wonderful liturgy, and this, the whole world suddenly became, sort of Greek Orthodox, and we had this amazing flash of a sort of Christian culture in the world, and then we could wrap it all up, and then it'll be the end, and surely that's preferable. But then you think, but actually then there's, all the amazing saints in the future that aren't here yet, they'll be lost. The great churches that we might build, sort of the theological insights that we haven't uncovered yet, something would be lost. And then you start to realize, okay, there is then that aspect of building something up. I think something that's quite helpful, I think, in questions like this is I think there are parallels to our situation now with sort of what we can think of as the very early church. Sort of especially once they realized, actually, okay, so Jesus isn't coming tomorrow after all. Okay, what are we going to do? It's a really interesting time in the history of the church, when they sort of have to then start to answer those questions. And there's a wonderful wealth of patristic sources on that. And that's when these sorts of ideas that then developed of, okay, well, anyway, sort of finishing with sort of that sort of a process of development ended with Augustine's City of God. And I think the latter part of that, where he's talking about the way in which the sort of the heavenly city and the earthly city are sort of intertwined, and that the sort of city of God sort of uses and is sort of the goods of the earthly city. And so it's not so simple as saying that, okay, well, actually, sort of building up God's kingdom, we can forget about this one. Actually, these things are deeply intertwined, and there's something analogous there too to how we understand sort of nature and grace being sort of entwined together. It's actually quite rare to find anyone that actually does believe that if we had the option to just wrap it all up and just have the end sort of come soon, but that's what we should do. We all sort of intuit actually that sort of building up a flourishing culture, you know, is the right thing to do. But we just have to do that in a way that's informed by our faith.
Yeah, great, thank you. I wonder if it's about figuring out how you weight them both so that
Yes, yeah.
Christians, we don't get overwhelmed by like moral panic. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, then we have, I think David was next.
Oh, right. Yes, sorry. Yes. Thank you. I was just wondering whether you had any reflections on how this might sort of land with the secular effective altruist community in terms of, because you say that Christianity has a unique contribution to offer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know whether you.
Sure. I mean, whenever I make a point when I can of sort of, you know, speaking with sort of, you know, people that are really involved with this, I've never experienced sort of anything but sort of a really positive response. I think again it comes down to that pragmatism of even if you know, because they would say something like, because they would say, okay, well actually a lot of these sort of, you know, whatever sort of cultural framework we're operating in, you know, let's let it be contingent on its utility in a sense. And so, you know, well, you know, if the Christians want to go off and really sort of, you know, play this song and do all this, even if we don't believe any of it's true, that helps us work towards our goals and our ends. And Toby does make I think quite a poignant point that actually perhaps in the experience of collaborating on such a big question as sort of achieving sort of existential security, we might actually learn quite a bit about how sort of people with different views of the world can interact and can get along and work together on something. So I see it, and I've only ever experienced from the other side, you know, sort of in a sense, sort of, you know, some excitement about the possibility of sort of coming together on, you know, sort of on a sort of common ground and sort of collaboration, even if sort of the ways in which we're looking at things might not work. And then there is an element of actually sort of saying, you know, I think along the way, you know, something will be shown. You know, if Christianity, you know, in 100, 200 years' time, is seen to have made a huge impact in essentially ascertaining sort of and securing humanity's future, I think that would be a good thing, just in terms of spreading the faith, reminding people that actually, you know, these values, you know, are really important to structuring a flourishing society. So,
Thank you.
Okay, one more quick question. Ethan was probably close. Yeah.
I'm just curious, I see there's a lot of kinship between the sort of argument you're making and, like, for example, Hegel saying that the family is a great institution for, you know, just having this natural relationship in the future. And I'm curious, I worry that culturally right now, especially with secularism being such a huge part that's dividing generations, that it's actually, the church tends to be more this conservative force of like, no, let's kind of keep things the same, let's really retrench, let's sever ourselves off in some sense from the developing future. And I'm curious if there's any institutional changes or ideological kind of like emphases that the church can place to advance more of this hope.
So, I mean, I can only answer really sort of from the Catholic point of view. I think, like when I read Gaudium et Spes, Vatican II, like it's just like a recipe of how to do this. And I think there's a really powerful sense there of sort of the more recent sort of ideas that have risen. Again, I can only speak sort of in the Catholic world of, you know, there was that book that was quite successful, The Benedict Doctrine, that what we need to be doing is actually just setting up these close-knit sort of, you know, really sort of orthodox Christian communities, let sort of the madness of the world just fizzle itself out, but just sort of, you know, there's almost like a protectionism there of, and I would be strongly against that. I see that there's a utility in that if you're worried about, you know, if you could almost just set up a parallel society, preferably one that sort of where families have lots of children, and then in a sense almost sort of the population game will just play out, and sort of secularization will sort of in a sense contracept itself out of existence, and then we'll just have large sort of Islamic and sort of traditional Catholic families abounding, and they'll sort of repopulate the earth. But I just, you know, I think that that is sort of missing a big part of just essentially the charisma of, you know, go and announce sort of the gospel and be engaged in that world. And I think, yeah, so sort of anything that I'm doing is based on definitely a sort of an institutional shift in the Catholic Church during the 20th century, because I couldn't do what if I sort of was saying these sorts of things 100 years ago. I'd probably get in a lot of trouble. But now there is a little more. There's some really beautiful things in Gaudium et Spes about, you know, people that are outside of the church and sort of it might not even be Christians, but whom God is using to great ends, sort of by their, you know, by their conscience, sort of working towards and by their sort of by their efforts. And I definitely see that, you know, in guys. There's a real goodness out there that sort of we're able to dialogue with on these questions. And yeah, and that's sort of how I see it. I'd pick it up on that.
Okay, thank you.